The first light of dawn crept over the concrete structure of Vora Medical Institute, casting a pale, indifferent glow across its tall, sterile walls. Leona Dorson parked her car in the staff lot, her fingers lingering for a moment on the steering wheel. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. At just 25 years old, she was still relatively new to nursing, and Vora, with its never-ending flow of patients and the high expectations placed on its staff, was a daunting place. Each shift here seemed like a fresh test of her patience, skill, and endurance. Today, though, felt particularly ominous. Leona exited the car, feeling the crisp morning air bite at her skin, and made her way through the sliding glass doors. Inside, the hospital was already buzzing with activity. Nurses hurried past her. Doctors discussed patient charts in quiet, urgent voices, and the air was thick with the familiar but uncomfortable sense of antiseptic and industrial-strength cleaner. This was Vora, an unyielding machine of patient care. Everyone here had a job to do, and the atmosphere demanded nothing less than constant efficiency and focus. Leona, however, was determined to be more than efficient. She wanted to be compassionate, to treat her patients as more than just entries on a chart. As she headed toward the locker room, she weaved through the crowded corridors with the practiced movements of someone used to navigating chaos. She slipped on her red nursing scrubs and secured her dark hair in a neat bun. Taking a moment, she stared into the locker room mirror, mentally preparing herself. "You've got this," she whispered to her reflection, her tone a mix of encouragement and urgency. "They need you."
Yo.
When she arrived at the nurse's station, the head nurse handed her a patient file without even looking up from her computer. "Clara Reynolds, room 412. She said briskly, tapping a few more keys. "Elderly woman."
Posthartat.
Leona flipped open the file and scanned the details. * Clara Reynolds. Age, 86. Condition, recovering from myocardial infarction. The CL. The journey through the hospital corridors was filled with the usual sights. Patients on gurneys. Families clutching coffee cups with tired eyes. Doctors speaking in quick, clipped tones to nurses about lab results and procedures. But as she approached room 412, a sense of calm washed over her. The sight of Clara Reynolds in the hospital bed caught Leona off guard. Clara was a tiny, frail woman, her skin pale and almost translucent, framed by a crown of white hair that looked soft as cotton. She was propped up on a mountain of pillows, looking smaller than Leona had expected, her thin arms peaky. Clara looked up, her dark eyes filled with weariness, and a weak smile touched her lips as Leona approached. "Good morning, Mrs. Reynolds," Leona said warmly, moving to her bedside. "I'm Leona. I'll be taking care of you today." "Oh, bless you, dear." Clara's voice was soft, a little raspy, but filled with warmth. "I'm all right, I suppose, just tired of being cooped up here." Leona couldn't help but smile at the older woman's feisty spirit as she began her assessment, checking Clara's blood pressure, monitoring her oxygen levels, and making notes in her chart. She noted the slight tremor in Clara's hands and the deep lines etched into her face. There was a profound loneliness in her eyes, the kind that only comes from years of silent endurance. Throughout the assessment, Clara peppered her with questions, showing a genuine interest in the young woman taking care of her. "How long have you been a nurse, dear?" she asked. "Do you have family close by? You're so gentle, you know. Most of the nurses here, they're so rushed, but you take your time. I appreciate that." A lump formed in Leona's throat as she gently adjusted Clara's pillows. She wondered about the life Clara had led, about the years of experiences that had brought her to this hospital bed, where she now lay alone. The gratitude in Clara's voice, the way her eyes lit up at the smallest kindness, touched Leona deeply. It was moments like these that reminded her why she had become a nurse. "It's my pleasure, Mrs. Reynolds," Leona replied softly. "I want to make sure you're comfortable and well taken care of." Over the next hour, Leona continued her duties, helping Clara with her morning medication, wiping her face and hands with a warm washcloth, adjusting the hospital bed to ensure she was as comfortable as possible. Each time she offered assistance, Clara responded with a warm smile and a quiet, heartfelt thank you. Leona could feel a bond beginning to form, a sense of responsibility for Clara's well-being that went beyond the routine duties of her shift. As she was preparing to leave the room, Clara reached out and lightly touched her arm. "Thank you for spending time with me, dear," she whispered. "It gets lonely here. I don't have many visitors."
Leona paused.
Her heart aching. "I'll be back to check on you later, Mrs. Reynolds," she promised. "Is there anything else you need before I go?" Clara shook her head with a small smile. "No, dear. You've been so kind already. Thank you." With a final, reassuring smile, Leona left the room, feeling a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, she was glad to have brightened Clara's morning, to have offered some companionship and comfort. On the other hand, she couldn't shake a gnawing sadness. How many other patients were there like Clara, left alone to navigate their recovery in a world that often felt cold and indifferent? She made a mental note to spend a little extra time with her when possible, knowing that sometimes the simplest acts of kindness could make all the difference. The morning flew by in a blur of activity. Leona checked in on other patients, administered medications, and coordinated with doctors on treatment plans. But as she moved through her rounds, her thoughts kept drifting back to room 412, to the frail woman who had thanked her so sincerely for simply taking the time to care. It was nearing noon when the calm of the nurse's station was interrupted by a sudden, shrill beeping. Leona's head snapped up, her eyes darting to the board displaying patient room alerts. Her heart sank as she recognized the flashing red light, room 412. Without a second thought, she dropped what she was doing and sprinted down the hallway, her mind racing through possibilities. Reaching Clara's door, Leona pushed it open, bracing herself for whatever emergency lay inside. What greeted her was not what she had expected. The smell hit her first, a sharp, acrid odor that made her nose wrinkle. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she saw Clara lying in bed, looking distressed. Her hospital gown and the sheets beneath her were stained with a yellowish liquid, and a tipped-over urine bottle lay beside her. Leona's instincts kicked in as she moved closer, assessing the situation. "Mrs. Reynolds," she said gently, trying to keep her voice calm. "What happened? Are you all right?" Clara's eyes remained downcast, and for a moment, she didn't respond. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, filling the room with an unspoken tension. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, Clara murmured, "The doctor did this." Leona blinked, unsure if she'd heard correctly. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Reynolds. Did you say the doctor?" Clara nodded slowly, her eyes still fixed on her lap. She didn't offer any further explanation, but the look on her face, a mixture of shame, fear, and something else Leona couldn't quite identify, sent a chill down her spine. Leona Dorson left Clara's room with her thoughts in turmoil, the usual hum of the hospital blending into a background blur as she retraced her steps back to the nurse's station. Clara's whispered words echoed in her mind. The doctor did this. Leona couldn't shake the look in Clara's eyes, the mix of shame and fear, as though she was too frightened to reveal the truth. Could it have been a misunderstanding? An accident that Clara had mistaken for something else? But then again, Leona had sensed something genuine in her expression, a buried vulnerability that told a different story. The nurse's station buzzed with the usual midday activity. Leona forced herself to focus, checking the charts, updating notes, and ensuring her other patients received the attention they needed. But her thoughts continued to drift back to Clara. The idea of a patient being mistreated, especially an elderly woman so vulnerable, was a violation of everything Leona believed nursing stood for. As the clock approached noon, Leona felt compelled to return to Clara's room. She told herself it was to check on the patient's condition. But deep down, she knew she wanted answers. She found Clara lying in bed, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. The old woman looked exhausted, but the tension in her face softened when she noticed Leona. "You're back, dear," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. "I wanted to make sure you're comfortable." Leona replied gently. She moved closer to the bed, adjusting the blanket and checking Clara's vitals, trying to gauge her mood. "Mrs. Reynolds, about what you mentioned earlier. Would you like to tell me more about what happened?" Clara's gaze flickered to the door, then back to Leona, as if checking for unseen witnesses. She hesitated, her thin fingers clutching the blanket, and then shook her head slightly. "It's nothing," she murmured, though her trembling hands betrayed her unease. Leona lowered her voice, keeping her tone soft and reassuring. "Mrs. Reynolds, I'm here to help you. Whatever happened, you don't have to face it alone. Please, if there's anything you're worried about, you can tell me." Clara looked at her for a long moment, her eyes searching. Finally, in a voice barely audible, she said, "It's just, the doctor, he doesn't like me much, I think." Her voice trembled, and her words came slowly, as if they were fragile things she was afraid might break. A chill crept over Leona. "Why would you say that?" Clara's eyes dropped to her lap again. "I've been here a long time, and I don't have family who can visit often. You see, the doctor, he thinks I'm a burden." She swallowed hard, her voice a barely contained whisper. "Sometimes he's rough and not very kind." Leona's mind spun as she took this in, but she kept her expression calm, hoping to reassure Clara. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Reynolds. You deserve the best care, everyone does, and you're not a burden to anyone, least of all me." She reached out, lightly squeezing Clara's hand. "I'll do everything I can to make sure you're treated with respect." Clara's fingers tightened around Leona's, her eyes wet with gratitude. "Thank you, dear," she whispered. "It's been so long since anyone cared." The words lingered between them, heavy and filled with meaning. Leona's heart ached, but she knew she had to stay calm. She had taken an oath, and protecting her patients was part of that oath, no matter how powerful her adversary might be. Clara deserved better, and Leona was determined to ensure that she got it. Returning to the nurse's station, Leona felt a surge of frustration and unease as she updated Clara's chart. She caught sight of another nurse she recognized from a previous shift, a woman named Tasha, who had worked at Vora for years. Taking a deep breath, Leona approached her casually. "Hey, Tasha, do you happen to know who's the primary doctor assigned to Clara Reynolds in room 412? Tasha frowned thoughtfully. "I think Dr. Sebastian Pierce is her attending." "Why? Did something happen?" Leona hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I'm concerned. Mrs. Reynolds mentioned a few things that don't sit right with me." Tasha's eyes narrowed slightly. "Dr. Pierce is one of the most senior doctors here. He has a certain way about him, if you know what I mean. Not everyone likes him." Leona sensed the caution in Tasha's tone. "A certain way?" Tasha gave a slight nod. "He's got a reputation for being tough, especially with patients who require a lot of care. He thinks they're taking up valuable resources." She lowered her voice. "Let's just say I wouldn't want to get on his bad side. He's got influence with the hospital administration." Leona felt a prickle of anger at the idea of anyone, let alone a doctor, seeing patients as burdens. But she kept her voice level, her mind racing. "Thanks, Tasha. That's helpful to know." As Leona returned to her duties, she felt a growing sense of unease. If Dr. Pierce had that much influence, confronting him directly might not be wise. Yet, she couldn't ignore Clara's fear or the underlying mistreatment that had clearly taken a toll on the elderly woman. She had to find a way to address this without putting Clara or her own career in jeopardy. Later, when Leona was in the break room, she tried to gather her thoughts, hoping to clear her mind with a few sips of tepid coffee. But Clara's face, her trembling hands, and her hesitant words haunted her. Her phone buzzed with a notification from the patient monitoring system. and she glanced at it absently before noticing the room number, 412. Her pulse quickened as she rushed down the hallway, adrenaline pulsing through her veins. When she reached Clara's room, she saw a shadow through the crack in the door. She hesitated, straining to hear, and caught the low, impatient voice of a man. "Don't know why you insist on clinging to life," he said, his tone a mixture of disdain and irritation. "There are patients who actually need this bed." Leona's hands clenched as she recognized the voice, Dr. Sebastian Pierce. She barely had time to process her anger before she heard a sharp, muffled noise, as if something had been slammed onto the bedside table. Clara's voice, barely audible, trembled with a quiet, fearful response. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." Without thinking, Leona pushed the door open and stepped inside. Dr. Pierce looked up, his expression shifting from annoyance to a cold, professional mask the moment he saw her. "Nurse Dorson," he said with a thin smile. "I didn't realize you were here." Leona's voice remained steady, though her heart pounded. "I'm checking on Mrs. Reynolds." "Of course," Dr. Pierce said, an edge to his tone that made her skin prickle. "I was just reminding her of the importance of cooperation. Some patients struggle with that." Leona moved to Clara's side, her hand resting reassuringly on the older woman's shoulder. Clara's gaze was downcast, her fingers twisting the edge of her blanket. "I'll take it from here, Dr. Pierce," Leona said, barely containing the anger in her voice. Dr. Pierce's eyes narrowed slightly, a flicker of displeasure crossing his face. But he simply nodded and left the room without another word, his footsteps fading down the corridor. Leona turned back to Clara, her voice soft and filled with concern. "Are you all right, Mrs. Reynolds?" Clara nodded, but her hands continued to tremble. I just don't want to be a bother," she whispered. "You're not a bother," Leona said firmly, "and you don't deserve to be treated like this." Clara looked up at her, her eyes brimming with tears. "Thank you, dear, but he's powerful. He's got everyone at this hospital under his thumb." Leona felt a swell of frustration and helplessness, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I'm here for you, Mrs. Reynolds. We'll figure this out together." As Leona left Clara's room, her mind raced. Dr. Pierce had revealed his contempt openly, almost as if he felt untouchable. But Leona knew she couldn't stand by and let him continue his mistreatment of Clara, or any other patient. She resolved, right then and there, to find a way to expose him. For now, she didn't know how she would accomplish it, but she knew she wouldn't back down. Clara Reynolds, and the silent pain of patients like her, deserved to be seen and heard. The rest of Leona's shift passed in a blur, her mind weighed down by her encounter with Dr. Pierce. She found herself replaying his words and the fearful look in Clara's eyes, the doctor's arrogance, the thinly veiled threat he directed toward Clara, and the condescending way he had addressed Leona made her blood boil. Yet, she felt a flicker of doubt. Dr. Pierce was a senior doctor at Vora, well respected, and known for his stern but effective methods. He had a reputation as one of the best, especially among his superiors. Could she, a temporary nurse, be reading too much into the situation? But every time she pictured Clara's trembling hands, the doubt faded. She had to do something. By the time Leona's break rolled around, she felt restless, her mind consumed by questions, deciding she needed more insight into Dr. Pierce. She headed to the small break room where she hoped to find one of her fellow nurses, maybe someone who knew more about his history at Vora. She found Tasha, the nurse she had spoken with earlier, seated at a corner table sipping her coffee. Leona approached cautiously. "Hey, Tasha, mind if I join you?" Tasha looked up, giving her a friendly smile. "Not at all. How's the shift going?" Leona slid into the chair opposite Tasha and took a breath before answering. "It's been interesting," she replied, choosing her words carefully. "Actually, I wanted to ask you a bit more about Dr. Pierce. You mentioned he's tough." Tasha's smile faded slightly, and she set her coffee cup down, her gaze growing thoughtful. Dr. Pierce is, well, he's a complicated man, been here for years, and he's got a lot of sway with administration. He's seen as effective, results-oriented, as they like to call it. Leona raised an eyebrow. What do you mean by that? Tasha leaned in, lowering her voice as if they were discussing a forbidden topic. He has this mentality that only patients who can contribute to society should get priority care. It's his way of, as he calls it, allocating resources effectively. She paused, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. He's cold, Leona. Many of us have seen how he treats certain patients, especially elderly ones who don't have family visiting or don't look like they have anyone to fight for them. Leona's stomach twisted as Tasha's words confirmed her worst suspicions. But that's not what medicine is supposed to be about, she murmured, her frustration seeping through. Tasha nodded, her expression resigned. Trust me, we know, but he's well connected. Even if you report something, the chances of it actually going anywhere are slim. She sighed, shaking her head. Look, I'd love to see him get what's coming to him, but I've got a family to think about. Most people here don't want to risk crossing him. Leona felt her resolve harden. The fear she had sensed in Clara, the warning in Tasha's words, it all painted a picture of a man who saw himself above the very rules he was supposed to uphold. Thanks, Tasha, she said quietly. I appreciate the insight. She spent the rest of her break lost in thought. The picture of Dr. Pierce's character was becoming clearer, but knowing the risk didn't make her feel any safer. She knew that standing up to him could mean jeopardizing her career, but if it meant protecting patients like Clara, she was willing to take the chance. As she returned to the nurse's station, Leona saw Dr. Pierce talking to one of the head nurses near the hallway. Her heart began to race. This was her chance to confront him, to let him know she wasn't afraid. Summoning every ounce of courage, she approached him, her spine straight, her chin held high. Dr. Pierce noticed her approach and offered a thin, professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. Nurse Dorson, he greeted, his tone polite yet chilly. Is there something you need? Yes, Dr. Pierce, Leona replied, keeping her voice steady. I wanted to discuss Mrs. Reynolds, the patient in room 412. His eyes flickered with a hint of irritation, though his smile remained in place. What about her? Leona took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. She mentioned something earlier. She seemed uncomfortable with the way she's been treated. Dr. Pierce's smile vanished, his gaze hardening as he crossed his arms. I assure you, nurse, I'm well aware of how to treat my patients. Mrs. Reynolds is an elderly woman who may, at times, misinterpret situations or imagine things. It's not uncommon for patients her age. He spoke in a dismissive tone, as though Clara's fears were nothing more than mild inconveniences. Leona's anger flared, but she kept her expression neutral. With all due respect, Dr. Pierce, Clara's concerns sounded very real to me. She deserves to feel safe and respected, regardless of her age. Dr. Pierce's eyes narrowed. Listen, Nurse Dorson, he said, his tone growing icy. You're here to assist, not to question my treatment methods. I don't need a temporary nurse telling me how to do my job. Leona felt a surge of defiance rise within her. I'm here to advocate for my patients, Dr. Pierce, and if something is wrong, I won't ignore it. For a moment, Dr. Pierce's face darkened, his eyes flashing with something like anger, but he quickly composed himself. I suggest you watch your tone, nurse, he said, his voice soft but laced with warning. It would be a shame if this conversation impacted your future here or anywhere else. Leona's pulse pounded in her ears, but she met his gaze without flinching. Patients deserve our respect and compassion, regardless of their circumstances or age. That's the standard of care I signed up for. Without another word, Dr. Pierce turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Leona standing alone in the hallway. her heart racing. She felt both exhilarated and terrified, knowing she had just drawn a line in the sand with a man who held significant power over her career. The rest of her shift passed in tense silence. Every time she crossed paths with Dr. Pierce, he barely acknowledged her, his expression as cold and dismissive as ever. She could sense his disapproval, the warning in his gaze that spoke louder than words. Yet, she also felt a fierce determination. She had done the right thing, and no amount of intimidation would make her regret standing up for Clara. As her shift ended and she gathered her things, Leona felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. She had stood up to a senior doctor, someone with far more power and influence than she had. But the thought of Clara, the vulnerable woman left alone in her hospital bed, relying on the kindness of strangers, kept her resolve steady. Before leaving the hospital that night, Leona stopped by Clara's room one last time. Clara was dozing lightly, her frail figure curled under the blankets. Leona approached quietly, placing a gentle hand on Clara's shoulder to wake her. "Mrs. Reynolds?" she whispered. Clara's eyes fluttered open, and she smiled faintly when she saw Leona. "Back again, dear." Leona nodded, her heart aching as she looked down at Clara. "I just wanted to make sure you were all right." Clara's smile faded, her gaze turning troubled. "Thank you, dear. It's nice to feel cared for." "You are cared for, Mrs. Reynolds," Leona replied, her voice firm. "And I want you to know, if you ever feel unsafe or uncomfortable, you can come to me. You're not alone in this." Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out to take Leona's hand, squeezing it with surprising strength. "Thank you, dear," she whispered. "Thank you for believing me." As Leona left the room, she felt the weight of the day pressing down on her. She had stepped into something much bigger than herself, a fight for the dignity and safety of those who were too often overlooked. And though the path ahead seemed fraught with risks and uncertainty, Leona felt ready to face it. She walked out of Vora Medical Institute that night with a new sense of purpose, her mind already planning her next steps. Dr. Pierce might be a powerful figure in the hospital, but Leona was determined to make sure that Clara, and every other patient who entered Vora, received the compassion and respect they deserved. The morning sunlight streamed through the hospital windows, casting a warm glow over the halls of Vora Medical Institute. Leona arrived early, feeling the weight of anticipation in her chest. After her tense encounter with Dr. Pierce the day before, she was more determined than ever to keep an eye on Clara Reynolds. The memory of Clara's trembling hands, her reluctant words, and Pierce's cold dismissal lingered in Leona's mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Leona slipped into her red scrubs and tied her hair back. Glancing at herself in the mirror, she looked calm, professional, just as a nurse should. But underneath the surface, she felt like she was stepping into uncharted territory. As she made her way to the nurse's station to check her assignments for the day, she caught a glimpse of Dr. Pierce in the hallway. He was speaking with a group of doctors, his expression animated, confident, as if yesterday's confrontation had never happened. Leona felt a surge of frustration but quickly looked away, reminding herself to stay focused on Clara. When she reached the nurse's station, she found her patient list waiting for her. As expected, Clara Reynolds was assigned to her care again. She grabbed the chart, feeling a sense of purpose settle over her. Today, she would uncover what was really going on. Leona approached Clara's room, her footsteps light as she knocked on the door before entering. Clara lay in bed, her eyes closed, looking frilier than ever. But as Leona stepped closer, Clara's eyes fluttered open, and a faint smile appeared on her face. "Good morning, Mrs. Reynolds." Leona greeted her gently. "How are you feeling today?" Clara's smile faded, and she looked down, her hands fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. "A little tired, dear," she murmured. "It's been a long stay here. I'm not as strong as I used to be." Leona sat down beside her, glancing at Clara's chart. "I know it's been tough, but you're recovering well. Soon enough, You'll be out of here. Back to your normal life. She hesitated, then continued softly. Mrs. Reynolds, yesterday you mentioned something about Dr. Pierce. I want you to know that if there's anything wrong, I'm here to listen. Whatever it is, you're safe with me. Clara's eyes darted toward the door, her fingers twisting the edge of her blanket nervously. For a moment, she seemed to retreat within herself, her shoulders hunching as though she wanted to disappear. But then she looked back at Leona, her eyes filled with a quiet desperation. It's hard to explain, she whispered. He doesn't like me, dear. I know it sounds silly, but there's a way he looks at me, like I don't belong here, like I'm just wasting space. Leona's heart ached as she listened. She could sense the depth of Clara's fear, the emotional toll this mistreatment had taken. You do belong here, Mrs. Reynolds, she said, her voice steady. You're a patient like everyone else, and you deserve the same care and respect. Clara's eyes softened, a glimmer of gratitude breaking through her fear. She hesitated, then spoke in a barely audible voice. He's done things, small things that make me feel. She trailed off, a shiver running through her. Yesterday, he spilled my urine bottle, said it was an accident, but he left me there, lying in it. He didn't even call anyone to help me clean up. Leona felt a rush of anger, her hands clenching into fists at her sides. She forced herself to stay calm, to keep her voice gentle. I'm so sorry that happened, Mrs. Reynolds. No one should ever treat you that way. You don't deserve that. Clara nodded, her expression distant. I didn't want to cause trouble, dear. It's just, I've never felt so humiliated. Leona placed a comforting hand over Clara's, her heart heavy. She wanted to say something that would ease Clara's pain, but the truth was, words felt inadequate. She could see that the real comfort Clara needed was for someone to believe her, to take her seriously. As Leona finished her rounds and attended to other patients, her mind remained fixed on Clara. She knew she couldn't let this slide, but she also knew she needed more than just Clara's word if she was going to confront Dr. Pierce again, or bring this to hospital administration. She would need proof, something undeniable. Later that day, during her lunch break, Leona decided to approach the head nurse. She knocked on the door, her nerves tingling, and stepped inside when she heard the faint, "Come in." The head nurse looked up, her expression neutral. Leona, what can I do for you? Leona took a deep breath. I wanted to talk to you about one of my patients, Clara Reynolds. I have some concerns about her treatment, specifically from Dr. Pierce. The head nurse raised an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. What sort of concerns? She mentioned a few incidents, Leona replied, choosing her words carefully. Things that sound unprofessional. She's feeling humiliated, scared even. I know she's elderly, but that doesn't mean her complaints should be dismissed. The head nurse listened silently, her face betraying no reaction. After a pause, she sighed. Leona, I understand your concern, but Dr. Pierce has been with this hospital for years. He's an effective physician. It's difficult to address something like this without concrete evidence. Leona felt a surge of frustration but forced herself to remain calm. I understand, but patients like Clara, they need our protection. She's vulnerable and alone, and she shouldn't feel threatened in a place that's supposed to care for her. The head nurse leaned forward, her expression softening slightly. I agree, but as I said, without clear proof, my hands are tied. Just be careful. Leona, Dr. Pierce isn't someone to cross lightly. Leona nodded, understanding the warning. As she left the head nurse's office, a plan began to take shape in her mind. If she needed proof, then that was what she would get. When her lunch break ended, Leona returned to her rounds, keeping an eye out for Dr. Pierce. She knew the risks of going up against someone so powerful within the hospital, but her conscience wouldn't let her back down. Clara deserved better, and Leona was determined to make sure she got it. As the day wore on, she noticed Dr. Pierce entering Clara's room. She felt a surge of protectiveness and decided to wait outside, pretending to review a patient's chart. Through the slightly ajar door, she could hear snippets of conversation. Dr. Pierce's voice was low, his tone cold. "You're still here, I see," he said, his words dripping with disdain. "Some patients have family who care enough to take them home, but I suppose you don't have that luxury, do you?" Leona's blood boiled as she listened. She wanted to burst in and confront him, but she forced herself to stay quiet, knowing this was the evidence she needed. Inside, Clara's voice was a soft whisper. I don't want to be a bother." "You are a bother," Pierce replied curtly. "And frankly, you're a waste of valuable resources. But as long as you're here, I expect you to stop wasting my time with these complaints." Leona's heart pounded as she held her breath, clenching the edges of her clipboard. She had heard enough. She couldn't stand by any longer. Without hesitation, she pushed the door open. Stepping inside, Dr. Pierce turned, his face momentarily startled before his expression hardened. "Nurse Dorson," he said, his voice laced with disdain. "This is a private conversation." Leona met his gaze, her voice steady. "This is a hospital, Dr. Pierce, where every patient deserves respect and compassion. No one should feel humiliated or threatened while under our care." Dr. Pierce's eyes narrowed, his mouth set in a grim line. "You're overstepping, nurse. I don't need lectures from temporary staff." Leona felt the anger bubbling within her, her voice shaking slightly as she replied, "I may be temporary, but my commitment to my patients is permanent. And I won't stand by and watch you treat Mrs. Reynolds or any patient this way." Dr. Pierce's face twisted in a cold smile. "You don't understand how things work here, do you? People like you don't get to question people like me." Leona refused to back down. "People like me are here to protect our patients. Dr. Pierce, that's my job, just as much as it's yours." For a long moment, they stood in silence, their eyes locked in a silent battle of wills. Finally, Dr. Pierce took a step back, his smile fading. "You'll regret this, Nurse Dorson," he said, his voice low and menacing. Without waiting for a response, he turned on his heel and strode out of the room, leaving Leona and Clara alone. Leona took a deep breath, steadying herself, then turned to Clara, her expression softening. "Are you all right, Mrs. Reynolds?" Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she reached out to take Leona's hand. "Thank you, dear," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Thank you for standing up for me." Leona squeezed her hand gently, her resolve solidified. "I won't let him treat you this way, not anymore." As she left Clara's room, Leona felt a fierce sense of purpose. She knew that the road ahead would be difficult, that she was risking her career by challenging Dr. Pierce. But she also knew that doing nothing wasn't an option. Clara, and every other vulnerable patient who passed through Vora's doors, deserved someone who would fight for them. And Leona was ready to be that someone, no matter the cost. The confrontation with Dr. Pierce lingered in Leona's mind long after he left Clara's room. She knew that standing up to him was only the beginning. Without support, without others to validate what Clara had experienced, she feared her efforts might be dismissed as nothing more than an overeager nurse's concerns. But Clara's gratitude, her whispered words of thanks, had strengthened Leona's resolve. She couldn't and wouldn't stand alone in this. As she stepped out of Clara's room, Leona spotted Tasha at the nurse's station, her friend busy filling out a patient's chart. Leona's pulse quickened. She hadn't told Tasha everything yet, just enough to gauge her reaction and test the waters. But now, with each passing hour, she felt more certain that she needed to bring Tasha fully into her confidence. "Tasha," Leona called out as she approached, keeping her voice low. "Can we talk somewhere private?" Tasha glanced up, an eyebrow arching with curiosity. "Sure," she replied, following Leona into the nearby break room. She closed the door behind them, the noise of the bustling hospital fading into a soft hum. Leona took a deep breath. gathering her thoughts. "It's about Clara Reynolds," she began, her voice steady but her heart pounding. "Yesterday, I overheard Dr. Pierce speaking to her. He was cruel, Tasha, dismissive and insulting. And today, he was even worse." Tasha's eyes widened, her expression shifting from curiosity to shock. "What did he say?" Leona hesitated, searching for the right words to convey the gravity of what she'd witnessed. "He implied she was a burden, that she was wasting hospital resources," she said, her voice tightening with anger. "He's intentionally making her feel like she's unwanted, even worthless. And I have a feeling that Clara's not the only patient he's treated this way." Tasha crossed her arms, her face darkening with concern. "I'm not surprised," she muttered. "Dr. Pierce has always been selective in how he treats his patients. The administration turns a blind eye because he brings in high-profile cases. But that doesn't mean he treats everyone equally, especially the elderly and patients who don't have families advocating for them." Leona felt a surge of relief. She wasn't imagining things, and she wasn't alone. "That's why I need your help, Tasha. Clara needs us to stand up for her. If it's happening to her, it's probably happening to others, too. We can't just ignore this." Tasha looked away, a flicker of hesitation in her eyes. "You know what you're asking, right?" she said softly. "Pierce has a lot of pull around here. If we speak out, he'll come after us." Leona nodded, the weight of her decision settling on her shoulders. "I know, but I also know that if we do nothing, he'll keep treating vulnerable patients like they don't matter. And that goes against everything we're supposed to stand for." For a long moment, Tasha remained silent, her gaze fixed on a spot on the floor. Finally, she looked up, her expression resolute. "You're right. This job is supposed to be about protecting people, not protecting our own comfort zones. Count me in, Leona. I'll do whatever I can to help." A wave of gratitude washed over Leona, and she reached out to squeeze Tasha's hand. "Thank you," she whispered. "I knew I could count on you." The two women spent the next few minutes strategizing, discussing what evidence they might be able to gather. Tasha offered to talk to a few other nurses who'd been at Vora for years, hoping to find more instances of Dr. Pierce's mistreatment of patients. They agreed that if they could collect enough evidence, they could present a united front to the hospital administration, a group of voices too strong to be ignored. Their conversation was interrupted by the door swinging open, and one of the senior nurses, Karen, walked in, her eyes narrowing as she saw them huddled together. "Are you two on break?" she asked, her tone sharp and suspicious. Leona forced a casual smile. "Just finished. We were catching up." Karen's gaze lingered on them, but she seemed satisfied with the answer and left without another word. Leona and Tasha exchanged a glance, the brief moment of tension a reminder of how fragile their plan was. Later that day, Tasha approached Leona with a glimmer of hope in her eyes. "I spoke to a few of the other nurses," she whispered as they passed each other in the hallway. "Turns out, Dr. Pierce's treatment of Clara isn't an isolated case. There's another patient, Mr. Hayes. In room 317, he's been here for weeks, and several nurses have seen Pierce belittling him, even refusing his requests for assistance." Leona's stomach churned as Tasha recounted the details. She couldn't imagine how many other patients had suffered in silence, afraid to speak up or believing they wouldn't be heard. She knew they needed more than just stories. They needed hard evidence, something indisputable. "Thanks, Tasha," Leona said, her voice filled with quiet determination. "I think I have an idea of how we can start gathering more evidence." That evening, as her shift wound down, Leona made her way to the administrative office, where patient feedback forms were stored. She knew it was a long shot, but she hoped that Clara or Mr. Hayes might have submitted feedback that could support their case. She combed through the files, carefully scanning each form. Just as she was beginning to lose hope, her eyes landed on a form signed by Mr. Hayes. The words "disrespectful" and "dismissive" leapt out at her, describing Dr. Pierce's attitude. The form detailed an incident where Pierce had refused to listen to Mr. Hayes's concerns about his treatment, brushing him off with a cold indifference. Leona's heart pounded as she scanned the document, her hands shaking slightly. This was exactly what they needed, proof that other patients had experienced Pierce's mistreatment. She took a quick photo of the form with her phone, careful not to leave any trace that she'd been there. The next day, armed with the photograph, Leona met with Tasha in the break room again. Tasha's eyes widened as she saw the image on Leona's phone. "This is good," she whispered, a spark of hope lighting in her eyes. "If we can get a few more accounts, this could be enough to start something." Encouraged by their progress, Leona and Tasha spent the next few days carefully documenting each incident they observed or heard about regarding Dr. Pierce's behavior. Leona continued to check in on Clara daily, gathering any details she could about Pierce's visits. The elderly woman grew more comfortable sharing her experiences, recounting moments of humiliation and fear that she had previously kept hidden. One afternoon, Leona managed to catch Dr. Pierce's rounds, hiding just out of sight as he entered Mr. Hayes's room. She held her phone discreetly, the recording app open, her pulse racing as she listened from outside. Inside, Dr. Pierce's voice was audible, cold and condescending. "I've already told you, Mr. Hayes. There's no reason to be bothering my staff with these requests. You're recovering. Just rest and stop complaining." Mr. Hayes's voice was weak but defiant. "I just want to understand my treatment, Dr. Pierce. I have a right to know." A harsh chuckle followed. "A right? This isn't a luxury hotel, Mr. Hayes. We're here to treat you, not cater to every whim." Leona's heart sank as she listened. She'd hoped Pierce would at least act professionally, but his cruelty seemed almost habitual, as if he'd done this so often that he didn't even try to hide it. Once he left the room, Leona slipped away, her hands shaking slightly as she stopped the recording. She and Tasha now had more than enough evidence, and Leona knew it was time to take their findings to the administration. The next morning, Leona and Tasha sat down with the head nurse in her office. They laid out their evidence, the patient feedback, the personal testimonies, and the recording. The head nurse's face grew increasingly grave as she listened, her expression a mixture of shock and anger. When they finished, she sat back, taking a deep breath. "This is significant," she said quietly. "I had no idea it was this bad. Dr. Pierce has always been difficult, but this crosses a line." Leona and Tasha exchanged a hopeful glance, but the head nurse's next words dampened their optimism. "However," she continued, "Dr. Pierce is well connected within the administration. This won't be easy, and there's no guarantee they'll take action. But I'll do everything I can to support you." Leona nodded, her heart heavy yet determined. They had taken the first step, but she knew the fight was far from over. The hospital administration might choose to protect Pierce, to brush their complaints under the rug in favor of preserving the reputation of a high-profile doctor. But Leona and Tasha weren't giving up. They would see this through, no matter the cost. As they left the office, Leona felt a surge of relief and purpose. She had allies now, people who believed in her mission to protect patients like Clara and Mr. Hayes. She knew the path ahead would be fraught with obstacles, but she also knew that they had a chance to make a real difference, to challenge a culture of neglect and mistreatment. And Leona was ready, with Tasha by her side and a growing circle of support. She felt more determined than ever to expose the truth about Dr. Pierce, and to bring justice to those who had suffered in silence for far too long. Leona's nerves were on edge as she made her way through the sterile halls of Vora Medical Institute the following day. She and Tasha had done it. They'd shared everything they knew about Dr. Pierce's mistreatment with the head nurse, and now it was in the administration's hands. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the real battle was only beginning. Dr. Pierce was powerful, influential, and well-connected, but Leona knew she'd come too far to turn back. The morning dragged on with routine rounds and patient check-ins, but a faint tension hung in the air. as if the hospital staff sensed the brewing storm. By noon, Leona learned from Tasha that Dr. Pierce had been called in for a private meeting with the head nurse and a representative from Human Resources. She felt a flicker of hope but forced herself to stay focused. She knew better than to expect immediate results. After her lunch break, Leona was on her way back to her rounds when she saw Dr. Pierce coming toward her down the hallway. His face was stony, his jaw clenched tight, and his eyes held a dark fire that made her pulse race. She braced herself, knowing that he wouldn't let her actions go without consequence. As he reached her, he stopped abruptly, blocking her path. "Nurse Dorson," he said, his voice tight and barely controlled. "I think we need to have a little chat." Leona met his gaze, refusing to back down. "Of course, Dr. Pierce," she replied, her voice steady. "What would you like to discuss?" He took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You've been quite busy, haven't you?" he sneered. "Going around, spreading rumors, stirring up trouble. I hope you realize what a foolish mistake you've made." Leona felt a rush of adrenaline, but she kept her tone calm. "I haven't spread rumors, Dr. Pierce. I've been advocating for my patients, and I've brought legitimate concerns to the appropriate channels." Pierce's face twisted into a mock smile. "Legitimate concerns? Is that what you call sticking your nose where it doesn't belong? Let me remind you, Nurse Dorson, you're a temporary hire here. Your job is to follow orders, not to question my methods." Leona's heart raced, but she held her ground. "My job is to protect my patients, Dr. Pierce. Every single one of them deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. And I won't stand by while you continue to humiliate them." Pierce's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing. "You really think you're going to get away with this, don't you? You think you can challenge me, and not suffer the consequences?" Leona felt the familiar anger bubbling within her, but she refused to let it show. "The only consequence I'm concerned about is the one you'll face if the administration decides to hold you accountable." Pierce's face flushed with anger, and for a moment, he seemed ready to explode. But then he took a step back, regaining his composure, his expression turning cold and calculating. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, nurse. I've been here for years. I've built a career on results, on respect, on making sure this hospital operates efficiently. Do you think a few unfounded accusations are going to bring me down?" Leona's voice was steady, but her hands were clenched at her sides. "They're not unfounded, Dr. Pierce. I've spoken with patients, with staff, and I have documentation of how you've treated people under your care. This isn't just about one nurse's word against yours. It's about a pattern of abuse." Pierce let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "Abuse? Don't be ridiculous. This is a hospital, Nurse Dorson, not a charity. We have a duty to prioritize resources, to focus on patients who can actually recover, who have a future ahead of them. The elderly, the weak, the burdens, as you like to call them, they're taking up space." Leona's anger flared, and she struggled to keep her tone even. "Every patient has the right to compassionate care. Dr. Pierce, you don't get to decide who's worthy and who isn't." Pierce's face twisted into a sneer. "You're so naive, nurse. You think you can fix this place with your righteous little crusade? That you can swoop in, file a complaint, and suddenly the world's a better place? I've been in this business long enough to know better." Leona felt a wave of disgust at his words, but she stood her ground. "Maybe I can't fix everything, but I can sure as hell try to make it better. And I'll do everything in my power to ensure patients like Clara Reynolds and Mr. Hayes receive the respect they deserve." Pierce's eyes flashed with contempt, his lips curling into a disdainful smirk. "Then I hope you're prepared for the fallout, Nurse Dorson, because you've just made a very powerful enemy." With that, he turned on his heel and walked away, leaving Leona standing alone in the hallway. She felt a mixture of exhilaration and fear coursing through her veins. She'd stood up to him, directly and without backing down, but she knew he was serious about his threat. Dr. Pierce was not the kind of man to let things go easily. Later that day, Leona and Tasha met in the break room, their usual refuge from the chaos of the hospital. Tasha's face was tense, her eyes filled with concern as she listened to Leona recount the confrontation. "He actually called patients like Clara burdens?" Tasha asked, her voice barely concealing her anger. Leona nodded, her jaw clenched. "Yes, he sees them as wasted resources, as if their lives don't matter." Tasha shook her head, disgust written across her face. "I can't believe this has been going on for so long, and no one's held him accountable." Leona took a deep breath, her mind racing. "We need to be prepared, Tasha. He's not going to go down without a fight, and I have a feeling he's going to try to discredit us." Tasha nodded in agreement. "He might try to turn other staff against us, make it seem like we're the troublemakers. We'll have to be careful about who we trust." As they spoke, the head nurse entered the break room, her expression grave. She gestured for them to follow her, and they exchanged a glance before rising to their feet. Leona's heart pounded as they followed her down the hall and into a small conference room, where a representative from Human Resources was waiting. The HR rep, a middle-aged woman named Ms. Sanderson, looked at them with a mixture of sympathy and professionalism. "Thank you both for coming," she began, her tone calm but serious. "We've reviewed the complaints and documentation you've provided, and we want to assure you that we're taking this matter very seriously." Leona felt a surge of relief, but it was tempered by Ms. Sanderson's somber expression. However, Ms. Sanderson continued, "Dr. Pierce has been a long-standing and respected member of this institution. The administration is currently divided on how to proceed. Some believe his contributions outweigh any issues he may have had with certain patients." Leona felt a wave of frustration. "Ms. Sanderson, I understand that Dr. Pierce has been here for years, but he's harming patients. People like Clara Reynolds are terrified of him. We can't just ignore that." Ms. Sanderson nodded, her gaze sympathetic. "I understand, Leona, but we must proceed carefully. A decision like this will have major repercussions for the hospital, and we need to ensure we have enough evidence to withstand any potential legal challenges." Leona felt her chest tighten. She'd expected resistance, but hearing it laid out so plainly was discouraging. "So, what happens now?" Ms. Sanderson sighed. "The administration has agreed to put Dr. Pierce on a temporary suspension pending further investigation. During this time, we'll be reviewing more patient records, speaking with additional staff, and gathering any further evidence." A sense of relief washed over Leona. It wasn't the immediate dismissal she'd hoped for, but it was a step in the right direction. "Thank you," Leona said, her voice filled with gratitude. "I know this isn't easy, but I believe it's the right thing to do." Ms. Sanderson nodded, her expression softening. "We're here to protect our patients, and we appreciate your courage in coming forward. Not many would have the strength to challenge someone like Dr. Pierce." As they left the conference room, Tasha squeezed Leona's hand, a smile of quiet triumph on her face. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually made a difference." Leona felt a surge of pride and relief. She knew there would be more challenges ahead, and she didn't doubt that Dr. Pierce would continue to fight back. But for now, she allowed herself to savor the victory, however small. That evening, before leaving the hospital, Leona stopped by Clara's room. The elderly woman was sitting up, a faint smile on her face as she looked at Leona. "Good evening, Mrs. Reynolds," Leona said softly, pulling up a chair beside her bed. "I wanted to let you know that Dr. Pierce won't be treating you anymore. He's being investigated, and the hospital is taking your concerns seriously." Clara's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth. "Oh, thank you, dear," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for believing me. For everything." Leona took Clara's hand in hers, giving it a gentle squeeze. "You deserve to be heard, Mrs. Reynolds. And now, I hope you can find some peace." As she left Clara's room, Leona felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She'd faced Dr. Pierce. She'd stood up for what was right. And together with Tasha, she'd helped ensure that patients like Clara would be safe from his cruelty. It was only one step in a long journey. But for the first time, Leona felt the satisfaction of knowing that her voice and her actions had made a difference. The next morning, Leona arrived at Vora Medical Institute with a new sense of determination. She knew Dr. Pierce was on suspension, but the fight was far from over. His supporters within the hospital would be looking for ways to defend him. And Leona understood that if she wanted lasting change, she couldn't rely solely on the administration. She needed to strengthen her case, gathering every bit of testimony and evidence she could find. As she walked into the hospital, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Tasha. "Meet me in the cafeteria when you can. I think I have news." Leona quickly made her way to the cafeteria, finding Tasha seated at a corner table, her face alight with purpose. "Morning," Leona greeted her, sliding into the chair across from her friend. "What's the news?" Tasha leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with excitement. "I managed to speak with one of the social workers, Jen. She told me that several of her patients have complained about Dr. Pierce's dismissive attitude. She didn't say much, but she hinted that she'd be willing to back us up if it comes to an official report." Leona's heart leapt with hope. A social worker's testimony could add critical weight to their case. "That's amazing, Tasha. With Jen's input, we could have documented evidence of a pattern in his behavior, especially toward patients who aren't in critical condition or don't have family to advocate for them." Tasha nodded, her voice softening. "There's more. I reached out to a few other nurses who used to work with him closely, and they all said the same thing, that he has this mentality about prioritizing resources. They've seen him refuse certain tests or procedures for elderly patients without giving them any real explanation." Leona's stomach churned with disgust, but she forced herself to stay focused. If we can gather their testimonies, it could show that he's selectively withholding care. Over the next few days, Leona and Tasha worked tirelessly to speak with the hospital's staff. They approached quietly, cautiously, so as not to alert Pierce's supporters or arouse suspicion among administrators who might be sympathetic to him. Many of the nurses were hesitant, fearful of retaliation, but a few agreed to help, recalling instances where Pierce had treated elderly patients as second-class citizens, neglecting their needs or dismissing their pain. One evening, Leona sat alone in the break room, reviewing her notes and organizing the information they'd gathered. They now had testimonies from 5 nurses, a social worker, and several patient complaints, all describing the same dismissive treatment from Dr. Pierce. She felt a surge of pride but also a nagging worry. Would this be enough? The door opened, and Leona looked up to see Jen, the social worker Tasha had mentioned. Stepping inside, Jen was in her mid-30s, with a warm smile that contrasted with the serious expression in her eyes as she approached. "Leona, right?" Jen asked, offering her hand. Leona nodded, shaking her hand warmly. "Yes, thank you so much for agreeing to meet with me." Jen took a seat across from her, letting out a sigh. "Look, I'm not going to lie, this is a risk for me. Dr. Pierce has connections, and he's always been untouchable around here. But I believe in what you're doing. I've seen the way he treats patients who don't fit his criteria of valuable care. It's heartless, and frankly, it's dangerous." Leona nodded, her voice filled with gratitude. "Your support means everything, Jen. This isn't easy, but we can't let patients suffer in silence." Jen reached into her bag and pulled out a small file. "I've been documenting certain cases over the last year, patients who complained about Pierce or who were denied tests they needed. It's all anonymous, but it shows a clear pattern. This could help you with your case." Leona took the file, her heart racing. "Thank you, Jen. This is exactly what we need." As Jen left, Leona opened the file, her hands trembling slightly. Inside were detailed notes on several cases, each documenting instances where Pierce had refused to provide care or had demeaned patients. primarily those without family or advocates. It was painful to read, but each line strengthened her resolve. By the end of the week, Leona and Tasha had assembled a thorough report, documenting every complaint, every incident, and every testimony they'd gathered. They submitted it to Ms. Sanderson in Human Resources and the hospital's Ethics Committee, hoping it would be enough to convince the administration to take permanent action against Pierce. 2 days later, Leona received a message from Ms. Sanderson. "Please come to my office at 2 p.m. We need to discuss the findings." Leona's heart pounded as she made her way to Ms. Sanderson's office, her mind racing with possibilities. When she arrived, Tasha was already there, seated beside Jen and 2 other nurses who had agreed to testify. The room felt tense, charged with anticipation, as they waited for Ms. Sanderson to speak. "Thank you all for coming," Ms. Sanderson began, her expression serious but warm. "We've reviewed the report you submitted, and I want you to know how much I admire the courage it took to bring this forward. What you've documented is deeply troubling, and it's clear there's a pattern here." Leona felt a surge of relief but kept her focus on Ms. Sanderson's words. "However," Ms. Sanderson continued, her tone cautious, "Dr. Pierce is already preparing his defense. He's hired a lawyer and is claiming that he's being unfairly targeted due to his position and the challenging decisions he has to make as a senior doctor. This is not going to be an easy fight." Leona exchanged a glance with Tasha, feeling the weight of Ms. Sanderson's warning. Pierce's defense would likely be ruthless, aiming to discredit their claims and undermine their credibility. But despite the pressure, Leona felt a steadfast determination growing within her. "I understand," Leona said, her voice unwavering, "but we have a responsibility to our patients. If Dr. Pierce continues to work here, more people will suffer. He needs to be held accountable." Ms. Sanderson nodded, her expression softening. "We're behind you, Leona. The Ethics Committee has decided to launch a formal investigation. During this time, we'll need all of you to remain vigilant and to document any further incidents." The room filled with a quiet sense of resolve, each person nodding in agreement. They were in this together, bound by their commitment to protect the patients who trusted them. As the meeting concluded, Leona felt both relieved and apprehensive. The investigation would bring scrutiny, not only to Pierce but to everyone involved. There would be whispers, rumors, and likely pushback from those who still supported Pierce. But she knew they were on the right path. Over the following weeks, the hospital was abuzz with the news of the investigation. Some staff avoided Leona and Tasha, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, while others quietly offered their support, grateful that someone had finally stood up to the powerful doctor. The tension was palpable, but Leona remained steadfast, determined to see justice through. One afternoon, as she walked past the break room, she heard voices whispering her name. Pausing just outside, she listened, recognizing the voices of 2 nurses who had often worked with Pierce. "I heard she's the one who started all this," one of them muttered. "Does she really think she can take him down?" "Apparently," the other replied, her tone dismissive. "Probably just looking for attention. Temporary staff like her don't last long here anyway." Leona felt a pang of hurt but pushed it aside, reminding herself that she wasn't doing this for recognition. She was doing it for patients like Clara and Mr. Hayes, for those who had suffered silently and alone. Steeling herself, she continued down the hall, her resolve unshaken. As the investigation progressed, Leona and Tasha were called in to give formal statements. They recounted every incident they'd witnessed, every patient's story they'd heard, detailing Pierce's behavior in painstaking detail. The process was emotionally exhausting, but each session reinforced their commitment to the cause. Finally, after weeks of interviews, testimonies, and document reviews, the hospital administration scheduled a meeting to announce the results of the investigation. Leona sat in the back of the room with Tasha, her heart pounding as she waited for the outcome. The hospital's director stood at the front, his expression serious as he addressed the room. Thank you all for your patience throughout this investigation, he began. After a thorough review, we have concluded that Dr. Sebastian Pierce engaged in a pattern of unethical behavior, demonstrating a disregard for the dignity and well-being of certain patients under his care. Leona felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she kept her gaze steady, waiting for the final verdict. As of today, the director continued, Dr. Pierce's employment with Vora Medical Institute has been terminated. We will also be implementing new protocols to ensure that all patients receive equitable care, regardless of age or social circumstances. A soft murmur spread through the room, and Leona felt Tasha squeeze her hand, a smile spreading across her face. They'd done it. They had stood up for what was right, and the hospital had listened. As the meeting concluded, Leona and Tasha exchanged a look of triumph, knowing they had changed something fundamental within the walls of Vora. They had faced down a man who had wielded his power carelessly, and they had emerged victorious, not only for themselves but for every patient who would come after. That evening, as Leona walked through the quiet halls of the hospital, she passed by Clara's room one last time. Clara was asleep, her face peaceful, a faint smile gracing her lips.
Leona paused.
Watching her for a moment, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. She had kept her promise to protect Clara, to stand up against the injustice she'd witnessed. And now, with Dr. Pierce gone, she knew that Vora Medical Institute would be a safer, kinder place for everyone. News of Dr. Pierce's dismissal swept through Vora Medical Institute like wildfire, sparking conversations in every corner of the hospital. Some staff members were openly relieved, while others were clearly rattled, questioning how an untouchable figure like Dr. Pierce could have been removed. For Leona, each passing day felt like an affirmation of the battle she'd fought, not just for Clara Reynolds, but for every patient who had suffered silently under Pierce's care. Leona arrived early on her first shift after the announcement, feeling the weight of curious eyes as she walked through the main corridor. Whispers trailed in her wake, and some of her colleagues gave her nods of encouragement, small but meaningful gestures that helped ground her in the aftermath of the struggle. Despite the uncertainty that still lingered, she felt a sense of accomplishment and resilience she hadn't felt before. As she approached the nurse's station, she saw Tasha waiting for her, a warm smile on her face. "Look who's become a bit of a legend around here," Tasha teased, her eyes gleaming with pride. "I've overheard at least 3 people this morning talking about what a hero you are." Leona chuckled, feeling her cheeks flush. "I'm not a hero, Tasha. We did this together. It wasn't easy, but it was worth every step." Tasha nodded, her expression turning serious. "You're right. We couldn't have done this alone. But you're the one who started it all. Leona, you believed in what was right even when it seemed impossible." They shared a quiet moment of satisfaction, knowing they'd not only exposed a harmful figure but had also sparked an important conversation about patient rights within the hospital. The following week, Ms. Sanderson from Human Resources scheduled a meeting to discuss the hospital's new policies aimed at improving patient care and addressing the gaps that had allowed Dr. Pierce's behavior to go unchecked for so long. When Leona and Tasha arrived at the meeting, they were surprised to see a larger crowd than expected. Doctors, nurses, social workers, and administrators filled the room, each face intent, serious, ready to listen. Ms. Sanderson stood at the front of the room, flanked by the hospital's director and members of the ethics committee. As she welcomed everyone, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation, a sense that they were all part of something transformative. "Thank you all for joining us," Ms. Sanderson began, her voice carrying a tone of gravity and purpose. "Today, we're here not only to acknowledge what has taken place but to commit ourselves to meaningful change. The recent investigation into Dr. Pierce's conduct has revealed vulnerabilities in our system, and we're here to ensure those are addressed." The room was silent as she continued, laying out a series of new protocols designed to protect patient dignity and reinforce ethical care practices. These policies included more rigorous checks on patient complaints, anonymous reporting systems, and mandatory quarterly training on empathy and ethical treatment. Ms. Sanderson looked directly at Leona and Tasha, a flicker of gratitude in her eyes as she spoke. We owe these changes to the courage of our staff who came forward to protect our patients. Their willingness to stand up for what is right has inspired this institution to be better. To do better. Leona felt a swell of pride as she met Tasha's gaze, seeing the same relief and satisfaction reflected in her friend's eyes. The policies weren't just words. They were concrete steps that would protect vulnerable patients like Clara and ensure that the hospital's culture would shift toward one of compassion and respect. As Ms. Sanderson concluded, she invited anyone who wished to share their thoughts or ask questions to speak. There was a brief pause before an older doctor rose to his feet. Leona recognized him as Dr. Malik, a physician who had always seemed thoughtful and respected by his peers. "I've been here for over 20 years, Dr. Malik began, his voice filled with conviction. "And in all that time, I've seen many changes come and go. But this is different. What we're discussing here isn't just policy. It's about the heart of medicine, about why we became doctors, nurses, and caregivers in the first place. I want to personally thank Leona and Tasha for reminding us of that." A murmur of agreement spread through the room, and a few people clapped softly. Leona felt a warmth fill her chest, a sense of belonging she hadn't expected. For the first time, she saw the direct impact of her actions not only on individual patients but on the institution as a whole. After the meeting, several staff members approached her, thanking her and offering their support. She met people she hadn't interacted with before, each expressing their commitment to uphold the new standards and improve the hospital's culture. It felt as if the hospital itself were breathing a collective sigh of relief, grateful for the chance to heal and start anew. But as the days passed, not everyone's response was positive. A small faction of staff remained skeptical, questioning the necessity of the new policies and even gossiping about Leona's role in Dr. Pierce's dismissal. Leona overheard whispers, the subtle glances of colleagues who felt she had rocked the boat unnecessarily. One afternoon, as she was heading to the cafeteria, a familiar voice stopped her. She turned to see Karen, the senior nurse who had often sided with Dr. Pierce, regarding her with a frown. "So, Nurse Dorson," Karen began, crossing her arms, "I hear you're responsible for all these new sensitivity protocols. Tell me, do you really think they're going to make any difference? Doctors have always had to make tough decisions."
Leona met Karen's case.
Standing tall, "It's true that tough decisions are part of the job," she replied calmly. "But there's a difference between tough decisions and cruelty. Everyone here should feel safe and respected, no matter their age or circumstances. These protocols will help ensure that happens." Karen scoffed. "Well, maybe if you stick around long enough, you'll understand that not everyone sees things through rose-colored glasses. Not everyone has the luxury of idealism." Leona felt a pang of frustration but didn't let it show. "If protecting patients means being idealistic, then I'm okay with that," she replied firmly. "I'd rather fight for what's right than stay silent in the face of injustice." With a dismissive shrug, Karen walked away, leaving Leona standing in the hallway. But despite the encounter, Leona felt a renewed sense of purpose. She wasn't here to please everyone. She was here to ensure that no one else suffered the way Clara had. In the weeks that followed, Leona noticed a transformation within the hospital. The new policies created a palpable shift, not only in how patients were treated but in how staff members interacted with one another. Nurses were encouraged to voice concerns without fear of retribution, and doctors attended empathy workshops that emphasized the importance of patient dignity. One afternoon, as Leona was finishing her shift, she received an unexpected call from a patient's family member. "Hello, this is Mr. Hayes' daughter." The voice on the other end said, "I wanted to thank you for everything you did. My father told me what you and the other nurses went through to protect him and others. You're his hero." Leona felt her throat tighten as she responded, "Thank you. Your father is an incredible person, and it was an honor to advocate for him. After the call, she sat in quiet reflection, realizing that this victory went beyond just a single patient or a single doctor. It was a step toward a culture of respect and empathy, a culture she felt proud to be a part of. Later that evening, she visited Clara's room once more. Clara's health had improved since Pierce's departure, and she greeted Leona with a warm smile. "My dear Leona," Clara said, reaching out to grasp her hand. "You changed this place. You changed my life. I never thought anyone would listen to an old woman like me."
Leona Knältby her bedside.
Her heart full. "You deserve to be heard, Clara, and because of you, so many others will be protected, too." Clara's eyes shone with gratitude, her hand squeezing Leona's. "Thank you, dear, for everything." As she left Clara's room that night, Leona felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. She knew her journey as a nurse would be filled with challenges, but this experience had forged her into the advocate she had always aspired to be. Leona walked down the quiet halls of Vora Medical Institute, feeling the strength of her purpose resonate within her. This hospital had become her home, a place she would continue to fight for, protect, and improve, and she knew, deep in her heart, that her journey was only beginning. The weeks following Dr. Pierce's dismissal were a whirlwind for Leona. With the new protocols taking effect, the hospital's atmosphere had transformed into something she could hardly recognize. Staff who had once walked with eyes downcast now held their heads high, exchanging genuine smiles with colleagues and patients alike. The hospital was slowly becoming the place of care and empathy it had always promised to be. Leona felt a renewed purpose each day, knowing that her actions had made this transformation possible. However, she was aware that change, no matter how positive, could be met with resistance. The whispers she heard from certain staff members hinted at lingering skepticism, especially from those who had supported Dr. Pierce. It seemed there was still a divide between those who embraced the new culture and those who resented it. One afternoon, after her rounds, Leona stopped by the hospital's break room. She found a small group of nurses huddled together, chatting over coffee. She recognized a few familiar faces, Tasha among them, along with Jen, the social worker, and several other nurses who had supported her efforts during the investigation. They waved her over, and she joined them, grateful for the camaraderie that had emerged through their shared fight. As she settled in, Tasha nudged her with a smile. "Have you seen the email from Ms. Sanderson? She's planning a meeting to discuss ways to ensure that patient advocacy remains a priority here." Leona's eyes lit up. "That's amazing. It's exactly what we've been working for." Jen nodded, her face thoughtful. "I'm still amazed that all of this came from just one person's courage. You were the first to speak up, Leona, and because of that, we've managed to bring about something real here." Leona felt her cheeks flush. "It wasn't just me. Every one of you stepped forward when it mattered most. We wouldn't have gotten anywhere without everyone's bravery." Jen smiled, but her expression turned serious. "It makes me think about the other hospitals out there, places where doctors like Pierce still operate unchecked. How many patients are suffering in silence because they don't have someone like you to advocate for them?"
Leona paused.
The weight of Jen's words settling over her. She had been so focused on the transformation at Vora that she hadn't considered the broader implications. If what they had achieved here was possible, then maybe it could serve as an example for other institutions. Tasha leaned forward, her eyes alight with excitement. "What if we could do more? I mean, this doesn't have to stop here, right? Maybe we could create a patient advocacy initiative, a group that educates and empowers hospital staff to protect vulnerable patients, not just here, but elsewhere too." The idea struck a chord with everyone at the table, and a quiet energy filled the room. They began brainstorming, throwing around ideas for what such an initiative might look like, how they could structure it, and what kind of impact it could have. Leona felt her pulse quicken. The thought of building something that would reach beyond the walls of Vora, something that would empower patients and give staff the tools to advocate for them, resonated deeply. As the group continued to discuss the idea, Ms. Sanderson herself walked into the break room. She glanced at them with an approving smile. "You all look like you're plotting something," she teased, stepping over to their table. Leona looked up, her eyes gleaming with determination. Actually, we were just talking about the idea of a patient advocacy initiative, a foundation or program that would reach beyond Vora, focused on empowering patients and staff everywhere to ensure ethical treatment." Ms. Sanderson's eyebrows rose, her expression one of pleasant surprise. "That's an incredible idea. With everything you all have done here, I believe there's a strong case for such a program. If you're serious about it, I'd be happy to support you however I can." Leona's heart swelled with excitement and gratitude. "We're definitely serious," she replied, her voice filled with conviction. "The changes we've made here are amazing, but we all know there are places where patients don't have the protection they deserve. This could be a way to make a lasting difference." With Ms. Sanderson's support, the group began laying out a plan for the initiative, which they decided to call the Lawson Advocacy Initiative in honor of Clara Reynolds and all the other patients whose voices had been silenced over the years. The goal of the initiative would be to create a network of healthcare professionals committed to ethical practices and patient rights, providing resources and training to help staff address mistreatment and neglect wherever it occurred. Over the next several weeks, Leona and her team worked tirelessly to turn the vision into reality. They spent late nights drafting proposals, creating training modules, and developing resources that would empower hospital staff to advocate for vulnerable patients. The Lawson Advocacy Initiative gained momentum, attracting attention from local healthcare organizations, who were intrigued by the positive changes they'd seen at Vora. One evening, as Leona and Tasha were finalizing the program's materials in the hospital's break room, a familiar figure walked in, Dr. Malik, the physician who had publicly supported their efforts during the hospital's meeting. He smiled warmly at them as he approached. "I heard about the initiative you're starting," Dr. Malik said, his voice filled with admiration. "I have to say, it's one of the most inspiring things I've seen in my entire career." Leona felt a swell of pride and gratitude. "Thank you, Dr. Malik. We want to make sure what happened here isn't forgotten, and we want other hospitals to feel empowered to do the same." Dr. Malik nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'd like to help, if you'll have me. I've seen firsthand how damaging negligence and cruelty can be, and I'd love to contribute to something that advocates for the people we're here to protect." Leona's face lit up. "We'd be honored to have you with us, Dr. Malik." With Dr. Malik's expertise and guidance, the Lawson Advocacy Initiative expanded even further. He helped them create specialized programs for doctors and medical students, highlighting the importance of compassion in medicine and encouraging a commitment to ethical care. The initiative quickly became a force within Vora, a beacon of hope and a reminder that medicine was about humanity first. When the program was officially launched, Leona, Tasha, Jen, and Dr. Malik stood before a crowd of healthcare professionals from Vora and beyond, presenting the mission of the Lawson Advocacy Initiative. As they spoke, Leona could see the spark in the eyes of those listening, a glimmer of recognition, of belief in what they were building. They were inspiring a new wave of advocates, individuals who would ensure that patients everywhere would be treated with dignity and respect. As the presentation concluded, Ms. Sanderson took the stage, her expression filled with pride. "This initiative," she said, "embodies the spirit of what healthcare should be. It's a testament to the bravery of those who stood up for what was right, even when it meant challenging the very systems they worked within." The Lawson Advocacy Initiative is not just a program. It's a promise to our patients that their voices will be heard, their dignity respected, and their lives valued. The room erupted in applause, and Leona felt a swell of emotion as she looked at her team, each of them filled with the same sense of accomplishment and pride. They had done something monumental, something that would ripple through hospitals, touching lives in ways they could never fully comprehend. After the event, Leona was approached by Mr. Hayes' daughter, who had attended the launch. She hugged Leona warmly, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "You have no idea how much this means to us," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Because of you, patients like my father have a chance to be seen, to be valued. Thank you for giving us hope." Leona smiled, feeling the depth of her impact settle within her. This was why she had fought so hard. Not for recognition, but for the quiet strength that came from knowing she had made a difference. That night, as Leona walked the quiet halls of Vora Medical Institute, she felt a profound sense of peace. She knew there would be more challenges ahead, and that some battles would be difficult. But she also knew that she had forged something meaningful, something that would outlast her time at Vora and continue to grow, fueled by those who believed in compassion and justice. The Lawson Advocacy Initiative was just the beginning, a promise to the patients who would come after, to the nurses and doctors who would carry on the torch. And as Leona looked toward the future, she felt ready, knowing that she would never stop fighting for the vulnerable, for the silenced, and for every soul that walked through those hospital doors. For she had become not just a nurse, but a true advocate, a protector of the very heart of medicine. Months passed, and the Lawson Advocacy Initiative grew stronger, its influence expanding beyond the walls of Vora Medical Institute. Leona found herself at the center of something much larger than she'd ever envisioned. The initiative had garnered attention from other hospitals, healthcare organizations, and even local government officials, all of whom were curious about the transformative program that had begun at Vora. The hallways of the hospital, once filled with tension, now hummed with a quiet optimism. Staff and patients alike noticed the changes that had taken root since Dr. Pierce's departure. Nurses felt empowered to speak up. Doctors worked with renewed compassion, and patients began to trust that their voices would be heard. For Leona, each day felt like a victory, not because of accolades or recognition, but because she could see the positive impact the initiative was having on people's lives. One afternoon, Miss Sanderson called Leona into her office. She greeted her with a warm smile, gesturing for her to sit. "Leona, I wanted to share some exciting news," Miss Sanderson began, her eyes twinkling with pride. "We've been approached by the State Health Department. They're interested in partnering with the Lawson Advocacy Initiative to make patient advocacy training a mandatory part of hospital accreditation across the region." Leona's eyes widened, her heart pounding with excitement. "That's incredible," she said, barely able to contain her joy. "It means that what we started here could become a model for hospitals everywhere." Miss Sanderson nodded, her expression serious. "This is a testament to the hard work you and your team have put in. You've built something truly extraordinary. Leona, this partnership will provide resources and support to hospitals that want to follow Vora's lead. They'll have access to your training modules, your policies, and everything you've built." Leona felt a mixture of pride and humility. "It's hard to believe that just a year ago, I was a temporary nurse, struggling to make a difference for one patient. And now, we're looking at something that could impact thousands. That's the power of one person's courage." Miss Sanderson said softly, "You've shown everyone here that change is possible, even when it seems unlikely." As the partnership moved forward, Leona and her team were invited to present the Lawson Advocacy Initiative at medical conferences, where they shared their experiences and the importance of patient advocacy in healthcare. Each time she spoke, Leona felt a renewed sense of purpose. She knew the challenges that hospitals faced and the pressures that could lead to neglect or unethical behavior. But she also knew that, with the right tools and mindset, those challenges could be overcome. One evening, Leona sat with Tasha and Jen in the break room, looking over the emails they'd received from other healthcare professionals who had implemented the Lawson Advocacy Initiative's training programs. Messages came from nurses, doctors, and administrators who had seen changes in their hospitals, thanking Leona and her team for the inspiration and guidance. "This is more than I ever dreamed of," Tasha said, her voice filled with awe. "We're actually making a difference. Not just here, but everywhere." Leona nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. I always knew we could make things better for our patients here, but seeing other hospitals take up the cause, it's a reminder of how powerful compassion can be. Jen leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful expression on her face. You know, Leona, you could take this even further. You have a gift for inspiring people, for making them believe that change is possible. Have you thought about writing about this? Maybe even creating a formal foundation? Leona looked at her friends, considering the idea. A foundation that could take everything we've done to a whole new level. With encouragement from her team, Leona decided to establish the Lawson Foundation for Patient Advocacy. The foundation would serve as a resource for hospitals, offering training, consulting, and advocacy services aimed at helping healthcare institutions develop compassionate care models. Leona and her team poured their efforts into building the foundation, creating educational materials, support networks, and grants to fund patient advocacy programs nationwide. As the Lawson Foundation gained traction, Leona found herself speaking at hospitals, universities, and even public forums, sharing the story of how one patient's mistreatment had inspired a movement. Her words resonated with audiences who had witnessed similar issues in their own communities, and many reached out to join the cause, determined to bring change to their local hospitals. One day, Leona received an invitation to speak at a national healthcare conference. It was the largest event she had ever attended, with professionals from every corner of the medical field gathered to discuss the future of patient care. Standing on the stage in front of hundreds of healthcare providers, Leona took a deep breath, recalling every step of her journey, the fear, the resistance, the small victories that had led her here. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice steady and filled with conviction. "A year ago, I was a new nurse, faced with a situation that challenged everything I believed in. I saw a patient, an elderly woman, treated with disregard, her dignity taken from her by those who should have cared for her. And in that moment, I realized that if I stayed silent, I would be complicit in her suffering." She paused, looking out at the audience, her words carrying the weight of her experience. "Today, I stand here because that patient, and others like her, deserve to be protected. Healthcare is about more than treatments and procedures. It's about honoring the humanity of those we serve. The Lawson Foundation exists because every patient has the right to respect, and every healthcare provider has the power to advocate for that right." The audience was silent, captivated by her words. Leona continued, sharing the journey that had led to the creation of the foundation and the impact it was having across the country. She spoke of the courage it took for her team to stand against institutional power, of the strength they found in each other, and the lives they had touched as a result. When she finished, the audience erupted in applause, and Leona felt a sense of fulfillment she couldn't describe. She knew, in that moment, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. After the presentation, Leona was approached by healthcare executives, nonprofit leaders, and even a few government officials, all interested in supporting the Lawson Foundation. One of the officials, a representative from the Department of Health and Human Services, extended his hand, his expression earnest. "Ms. Lawson, your work is exactly what we need in healthcare," he said. "I'd like to discuss the possibility of incorporating patient advocacy training into national healthcare standards. With your foundation's resources, we could transform the way patients are treated across the country." Leona's heart raced. "That's incredible. I'd be honored to help make that a reality." In the months that followed, the Lawson Foundation partnered with the Department of Health and Human Services, working to develop nationwide training standards for patient advocacy. Hospitals began to implement these standards, ensuring that every patient, regardless of age, race, or background, would be treated with the respect and dignity they deserved. One evening, as Leona walked through the quiet corridors of Vora Medical Institute, she stopped by Clara Reynolds's old room. The bed was empty, waiting for a new patient, But the memory of Clara's courage and resilience filled her with gratitude. Clara had been the spark that had ignited a movement, and Leona knew that everything she had achieved was because of the faith Clara had placed in her. Leona's journey had taken her from a new, uncertain nurse to a national advocate, leading a movement that was reshaping the healthcare landscape. But through it all, she remained grounded, her heart rooted in the simple truth that had guided her from the beginning. Every patient deserves to be seen, to be heard, and to be valued. As she stood in the empty room, she whispered a quiet thank you to Clara, a promise to continue fighting for patients everywhere. The Lawson Foundation was her legacy, a testament to the power of compassion, courage, and unwavering advocacy, and Leona knew that, as long as there were patients who needed her, she would never stop fighting for them.